Hello and welcome to A Week in My Flexible Working Life, sponsored by Condeco, workspace solutions for the future at work. I'm your host, Juliet Mann. Each episode, I'll speak with business leaders and influencers about how their workplace is changing and what the future of work could look like for us all. My guest today is Eero Vaara, a Professor of Organisations and Impact at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. But he also serves as Visiting Distinguished Professor at Aalto University in Finland, and he leads the Future of Work programme there, which was set up pre-pandemic, but's quickly adapted to fit what he calls our new working reality. Well, look, Eero, it's great to have you on the podcast. First of all, what is that new working reality to you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great podcast series and it's a great opportunity to be talking about this important topic. I think reality as such that with the pandemic, with COVID-19, I think we have seen a special moment which has accelerated these changes in working life that I think are a part of a bigger trend, but it's just made things very different. And if we go back in time, I think things like flexible working have already been there, but it's this special time that we've been experiencing that it's made it so different. Now what's interesting is to see what's going to happen post-pandemic.
And what is the Future of Work programme that you're working on all about? I think it's interesting that it was set up before this huge shift that we're seeing across the world.
I think we were incredibly lucky or unlucky with that in the sense that we got it going just set up before the pandemic hit. But the basic idea is simple. So we are trying to make sense of what's going on in organizations of different kinds and really forward looking in terms of what kinds of organizational or strategic phenomena people are facing now and in the future.
Now, we're going to dig in a little deeper to all of that in a minute. But the other reason I really wanted to talk to you is because you're from Finland. In fact, Aalto University is in Finland. It's a place that's often billed as a shining example for flexible working. Now, I appreciate it's your normal, but having worked all over the world, why is Finland unique?
Well, I think Finland is in some ways a forerunner in these things, that I think there's a long tradition or many attempts over time between the employer and employee associations and the government to make sense of what's happening in working life. And in the best of cases, it's been forward-looking, meaning that, especially when we're talking about flexible working, there's been attempts to put in place legislation, which is actually very rare in this area. So one of the interesting things is this Working Hours Act that came into effect in the very beginning of 2020, which served as a basis for organizing flexible work, meaning both time and space.
But those practices were in place way before 2020, weren't they? You know, people deciding to start their day maybe 3 hours later and finishing it 3 hours later than your standard 9 to 5. Is it something to do with maybe the geography, the landscape, the climate in Finland, whereas people would get snowed in more often?
Maybe it's the climate, it's snowing and it's raining more here in the UK. But I think it's more about this tradition of working together. I think Finland is high on institutional trust. And I think this is one of the reasons for why people have been together trying to make sense of these things. It doesn't mean that, it would be totally different from many other countries. But I think there is this tradition which is very much based on trying to together agree upon such things, both at the institutional level, meaning legislation, for instance, the Working Hours Act, but also at the organizational level in terms of, in the best of cases, trusting one's counterpart in trying to agree upon the conditions to be followed.
And why do you think it is that Finnish companies are ahead of the curve, the forerunners, as you say? I'm thinking of companies like Supercell, like FuturePlay, and there's a theme there, isn't there? Tech startups.
Yeah, I think that's one important thing. So I would say that, and this may be a stereotype, and stereotypes are dangerous, but overall, I think Finnish working life is characterized by pragmatism and consensus orientation, and I think these features help in terms of pushing people to trying to agree upon things like, flexible working. But I think it's being really spearheaded by startups or these tech companies that have been developing in the past, 20 years or so, which I suppose embody these features such as being self-directed in nature and really being empowering, meaning that people are from the start really willing to do this in terms of being responsible wherever they are working. And at the same time, the flat hierarchies have been helping in terms of avoiding unnecessary red tape also in terms of agreeing upon these arrangements.
So it's not just society, companies too. So are you saying those with a flatter hierarchy are more adaptable when it comes to flexible working?
Absolutely. I think it helps a great deal. If from the start the organizations have this spirit of people working together and people are empowered and they take charge of projects and issues, I think this is the best possible basis for also being very successful in dealing with flexible working. Whereas more, older, bigger, complex organizations that have been there for a long time, they're just more difficult in the sense that there are a lot of practices, a lot of norms and regulations in place, and it's hard to change those. If you start changing things in one place, it also then sometimes becomes difficult if it's different in another place in such more complex organizations.
So give me an example of some of these pioneering self-directed companies and what the secret really is to their success.
Well, I'm thinking about, for instance, game development companies. And of course, they are a very special, unique type of a company. But I think they are really driven by this idea that people are working and taking charge of what they are responsible for and coming up with initiatives and following them to the extent that it's a lot of freedom. So these companies, some of them are calling for a no bullshit approach, for instance. That's from a company that's called Future Play, meaning that one really tries to do one's best in avoiding.
Hang on, Eero, are you telling me that that's their actual mission statement?
Well, it's close. If you Google the website, you get that. So that's close to that. But I think this company would hate to call it a mission statement. I think those are exactly the kinds of words that they would like to have in place. And they would instead talk about tribes and teams that are self-directed. And that would be, more about no nonsense, or in their case, no bullshit.
So for a company that isn't Scandinavian, that doesn't have those Nordic characteristics of pragmatism and institutional trust, that isn't a tech startup or a gaming company, that maybe has a long, say, a British or an Italian heritage, how could employers adapt then to suit the workplace?
Well, to me, it's very simple in terms of together trying to make sense of things, so that the policies about flexible working, for instance, wouldn't only be coming from the top, but would be something that the different stakeholders would together be focusing on. And then allowing people in the different parts of the organizations to themselves agree upon what's best for these particular people.
So I suppose what you're saying is that employees need to become stakeholders in the company, that they're not just worker bees.
Absolutely. I think that's it in the sense of this very idea of flexible working, that people are not working at the office or at the workplace. So I think it really means that people have to take charge of their projects and initiatives and be responsible. And I think this goes hand in hand with the idea of empowerment.
Tell us a little bit more about that empowerment. And I suppose how what you're seeing maybe compares to different countries' style of forward thinking. How would you say this attitude and this focus on work compares to Silicon Valley? That's somewhere else that you've spent some time.
Silicon Valley is actually a really good example in the sense that people have been probably working far too much on the whole, but still it's been based on this idea that people try new things and they are really committed to the projects and initiatives and ideas and whatever they're responsible for. So I think there's been a lot of flexible working and empowerment in these settings. So I think Silicon Valley is a great example. Of course, it gets a little bit more complicated when the companies grow up a lot. So let's talk about Google or Apple or similar global giants. So it's harder to maintain this idea that, everyone would meet and together develop the best possible guidelines and policies. So there we have seen also these policies coming from the top.
We've also seen companies say, right, well, if you're going to work from home, you haven't got the commute. So maybe we'll tweak the salary bands.
Absolutely. And that's another interesting phenomenon. So it's happening right now that some of these bigger companies in particular are really developing policies such that it depends on where you are, where you're living. It depends on the cost of living as to how much you will be paid in this environment of flexible working. But to be straightforward in terms of what I'm thinking that it's better if these people are together able to decide upon the policies and practices and do that, almost at the team level, meaning that every individual would be able to be very much involved in terms of determining as to where to work and how and when.
I suppose what you're saying, Eero, is that disruptors and firms that are starting from scratch can, in a way, rewrite the rule book. The challenge is what happens when they get bigger, the scaling up. So what is it that changes? You've talked a little bit about the great big tech companies and these elements of control that they're weaving into their policies. What are the challenges you see?
Well, I think there are lots of challenges. And just to be fair, also, I think the big tech companies are not that bad at all. I think in their culture ingrained in their culture is this idea that people should be empowered. It's just that the complexity and the sheer size of these companies had made it such that they have developed these policies where they have to have like a set of policies at the corporate or at the group level. I think it actually gets more difficult when you get the question of more traditional organizations, which are characterized by operations and all kinds of things happening in many cases across the globe. It's really hard to then develop overarching strategies or policies that will help in determining basically the rules of the game.
You talk about traditional workplaces. I suppose I'm thinking of manufacturing, healthcare. I mean, are there certain sectors that are tied to space and time where the future of work looks more or less like the past and the now?
Absolutely. There's an illusion at times when we're talking about these things as to how the workplace is changing and about the future of work, in the sense that we're focusing on certain kinds of organizations or certain kinds of professionals. And we are easily forgetting that there already are a number of occupations and professions which either really have to be there. So manufacturing, it's really hard to do that remotely, although this is, by the way, happening as well. But let's not get into that. And then there are also professions and occupations like yours and mine, which have, also in the past been pretty flexible.
So pragmatism then is a big part of it. I suppose if you wanted a flexible working life, you wouldn't necessarily apply for a job in a factory that made cars, for example, because you need to be there at a certain time to do that job. There will be certain types of organisations where people default to that pragmatism. It's going to be harder for others to change their mindsets, maybe because they're a different generation, maybe because they're set in their ways, but also there are just those constructs of working life which are very difficult to unpick.
That's right. And so I'm getting back to these themes of trust and empowerment, and then simply, taking these issues seriously. These are the kinds of things that would help also more traditional organizations to deal with the difficult questions of, how to organize flexible work.
So do we need a social movement?
In a way, I think we need that. But in the ideal world, it's also a question of social movements within organizations or within specific companies that would be needed. What I mean is that the bigger companies, the more traditional companies, I think it's easily happens such that there are already so many rules and regulations and practices and norms and values in place that unless one really focuses attention on these new practices and discussion or dialogue really needed to make sense of the future of work, or in this case, flexible working, I think it's really hard to be able to succeed in changing these organizations.
Eero, what about technology? I'm thinking of artificial intelligence becoming that catch-all term we hear more and more about. What does it realistically look like in our workplaces? And are there any downsides to how it's developing and evolving?
Yeah, I think in some ways, the technology that we're using already now, it's the pandemic that has, had so many different kinds of effects on organizations and people that has also helped people to learn about how to use Zoom or whatever technology one is using in terms of connecting from wherever they are. So I think this is helping. This is helping a great deal in terms of moving remote work or the different aspects of flexible working forward. So I think this is a trend that will be going on also in the future. And I think, and I'm quite sure that we will be seeing more and more technology coming with that. Of course, again, depending on where you are and depending on the industry, on the type of organization and your role in that as to whether AI really has a fundamental impact.
But technology has really enabled much of this revolution in the way we work.
That's absolutely the case. We wouldn't be seeing this, couldn't have imagined this even like 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago.
So in a way, the pandemic has come at a crucial moment where all the stars are aligned. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I think this is really the most interesting time point, actually, from the point of view of like following these trends and seeing what's happening, this post-pandemic time when we are really now starting to see people coming back to the workplace. And it's now when these new policies are being created and tested. And in the best of cases, of course, I hope people will be agreeing or together developing the practices that would suit each and every one in their workplaces.
I want to come back to this notion of trust and pragmatism that you talk about, because I know in not just some organizations, but in some cultures, that's going to be tricky. There's a big difference, isn't there, between the British way of working, the more Mediterranean way of working, the American style, and of course, looking east, China.
That's right. And that's why it's so difficult also in terms of seeing the global trends and as to how they are changing. So I think that it will always depend on the institutional setting and the culture. You can call that country culture, for instance, as to how it will be shaping up. And of course, already, in the past, it's been very different, great differences across these different countries that you mentioned. So it will be interesting to see how it unfolds.
How have you noticed things have been different in all the different places you work? Because obviously you're affiliated to the university in Helsinki, but you're living in Oxford, you're at Oxford University, you spent time in Silicon Valley, you've travelled the world.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of differences, but to be honest, the differences between these Western cultures are smaller than those compared with, for instance, China or India or many other places. So in the global scale, what we're seeing is relatively similar in terms of what it looks like, in terms of, remote work, going to flexible working and so on. But when we have a close look at the actual practices, then we also see fundamental differences. The laws and regulations that provide the institutional framework for this, they are just very different, let's say, from the Nordic countries to Central Europe, Southern Europe, Middle East, the UK, and so forth.
But how does technology enable all of that to be a little bit more joined up?
Yeah, I think it enables a lot, but we also then see like different realities being created. Like there's one reality when people, let's say in Google, are working together in their global teams. And it's like very similar, but at the same time, it may be that depending on where you are, the actual legal and institutional frameworks are very different.
And I want to come back to this concept of empowerment and empowerment of employees. And you really think that's central to the future of work, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this is an important part of the, being successful in the future. I really do think that. And I think that many of these trends go hand in hand, meaning that more empowerment just helps a great deal also when dealing with these issues of flexible working, for instance, meaning that basically that then when people can themselves determine what they're doing, where and how, in the ideal case, that's usually the best solution, as long as they are committed to the organization or the company.
What you're talking about here, this post-COVID reality, is a big shift. It's a rupture. For the listener, and what would you say the key things you'd like them to take away from this discussion?
Things don't just happen. So when I'm thinking about, people that I know, for instance, and flexible working, I think the best thing to do is to try to figure out oneself as to what's the best way of continuing or organizing one's working life. or perhaps also the work-life balance as it comes to, remote working. So in the best of cases, people would become active in terms of trying to make sense of the practices in place. And in the best of cases, also, of course, the supervisors or the employers would be proactive in terms of seeking not top-down policies to be implemented, but dialogue between people so that this would lead to the best possible outcomes.
So what you're saying is that employees should not just assume they're going to fit into one box, that they need to work out before they go into any workplace what's going to work best for them, and then take that to the company.
Absolutely. I think this is what I would say is the most important takeaway.
So let's just take that a little bit further. I've been talking to some friends of mine who are recruiting, and they're tearing their hair out because they're finding that the applicants are already putting demands down before they've even got to the interview stage. It seems like the balance of power is shifting. Instead of the employer saying, right, I'm looking for someone with this skill set, with this availability, the people with those skills are saying, I'll do it, but on my terms.
Exactly. I think this is what we're seeing happening. People who have either been now used to arrangements that have been working pretty well for them, or people who have a lot of bargaining power because they are experts or in companies need them. I think they are in this new kind of a power position to also negotiate for these conditions in terms of where to work and how. So I think this is an important phenomenon that may have in fact caught some companies